I've been reading a book, which I'll show you in a few minutes, called Paradoxes of Group Life. And it's really inspired me to think about paradox and to look at the paradoxes that exist within our religious teaching. So we're going to look at that this morning, and then we're going to go into a series talking about paradoxical ideas over the next coming weeks and indeed months. So that's what you've got to look forward to. But today we're just concentrating on paradox itself, which is defined as a statement or proposition seemingly self-contradictory or absurd, and yet explicable as expressing a truth. So we're familiar with a number of paradoxes. One example is less is more. We know what this means, don't we? Another is, this is by Francis Bacon. The most corrected copies are commonly the least correct. Here's the book that I've been looking at, Paradoxes of Group Life. It's recommended to me by one of my colleagues. And I've really enjoyed reading this and thinking about groups in terms of paradox. And this is one of the things it says here. Circles. One cannot escape the feeling that an exploration of paradox is like walking in circles. It is hard to know where you have come from and where you are going. But the more one lives with a paradoxical perspective, the more one develops a tolerance for circles and for the places where two apparently contradictory paths join. Now, many religious teachings are expressed in terms of paradox. And in that short passage that I read at the beginning of the service, Matthew 11, there are 3 paradoxes within those 6 verses. I wonder if you spotted them. You have hidden these things from the wise and prudent and have revealed them to babes. There's a paradox. It reminds me of that fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. But the second one, no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and the one to whom the Son wills to reveal him. See, there's the paradox there. There's 2 figures who know each other, and they're the only ones that know each other, but then somehow the Son reveals the Father to others who he chooses. So there's a paradox there. And then, of course, the final one that I actually talked to the children about, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. These are the paradoxes that are presented in the end of that chapter. Indeed, there's another one earlier on. If you want to go and look for it, that can be your homework for this week. Go have a look through Matthew chapter 11 and see if you can spot the earlier paradox. There's also 1 Kings 3 that I read, the story of Solomon. You see, Solomon was gifted that which he did not ask for because he did not ask for it. And that's reminiscent of many fairy tales as well, this idea that you gain something by not asking for it. So the question is, why do religious concepts, why are they expressed in paradox like this? And I think there's a couple of reasons. I think the main one is that it's an expression of really who we are, our inner reality and our outer reality. We tend to think of ourselves in external terms, and we tend to approach the word in external, literal terms. And yet there is within the word and there is within us something which is deeper, something which is paradoxical, something which is not easy to predict based on what we see. And I think paradox is an expression of this. We also, in our attitude to life, tend to take very exclusive positions on one side or another. We tend to think in these poles, don't we? Polar opposites. And we think either or. We're not very good at thinking both and. And I think this is part of the nature of paradox as well, and why paradox is important. And I think we forget that we live in a world which is based on appearances. Now let me give you an example from Swedenborg's work. The spiritual idea of the death of the body is that of newness of life. Now when I first read that had me scratching my head. What is going on here? And he goes on and explains it in this way. He says, the angels know nothing of death, nor of sickness, and therefore have no idea of them. But in their place, when man reads of them, they have the idea of the continuation of life and of resurrection. And this because when man dies, he puts off only that which has served him for use in the world, and enters into the life in which he had been with his spirit. See, so for an angel, what we call death, natural death, is a rebirth. It is a coming into awareness of the spiritual world. And this is where Swedenborg makes this connection between death as it is referred to in the Bible and newness of life, of rebirth, of regeneration. And you know, we talk about being spiritual beings having a natural experience. And that is who we are, spiritual beings having a natural experience. And yet we place a great deal of store and emphasis upon, the things I can touch, the things I can see. Now, can we relate to the idea of paradox and experience it for ourselves? Well, I think we can, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So I want you to look at my word here, paradox. Can anybody tell me what colour it is, please? Black? Black? It's intended as black. I want you, please, to look at the P. Focus your eyes on the P. Pam, are you able to do that scene one for me, for the people who are watching at home? So look at the P. Keep your eyes on it. What colour is it?
White.
Especially when I do that. It's white. It looked black, didn't it? It looked black because of the background and the bright light, especially the highlighting of the P with the white behind it. But it's white. Black is white. I want you to think about communication. See, when we talk together, how do we talk? We use words. But I use a word that I think reflects a certain meaning. You hear that word and you put your meaning into what you have heard me say. So you put your meaning into the word you hear. Does that mean you understand me? Not necessarily. Because if you mean something subtly different by what I mean by that word, then we work at cross purposes. Here's an example. What do you call this? What do you call this? Shoes. What type of shoe? A runner. Anybody got any other words for this? Casual shoes? Well, let me tell you, in my childhood, I went to 4 primary schools, 4 different primary schools in 4 different cities. And in every single one of those cities, they had a different word for these. So I learnt runners, trainers, sand shoes, running shoes. There are all sorts of things that these were called. And I remember it because, of course, you have a PE, physical education lesson, and your teacher says, right, children, get out your sand shoes and put them on. I thought, what on earth are sand shoes? And I had to learn, this is a sand shoe.
No,
It's not a sand shoe. Well, it was where I went to school on that particular occasion. I had to get my trainers, my runners, my joggers, whatever I called them, to put them on. When I was 17, my family moved back to Australia. We'd been living in Glasgow, or near Glasgow, and I'd been going to school there. And I came back to Melbourne eventually started my degree. Now, we went through Perth on our way to Melbourne that year, and I was 17 years old. Now, we were with my family in Perth on the beach or on the river somewhere, and Mum made the comment, "Oh, we've got to go and get David some new trainers." All right? This is what we called these in Paisley in Scotland, where I had been living, trainers. And my family, my extended family, were aghast. They were going, "Dave, trainers? What's David wearing trainers for?" They thought they meant nappies. As a 17-year-old, they thought I was still in nappies because my mum said we needed to buy David more trainers. Do you see how words, we invest a certain meaning in them, but they're not always the same meaning, and so we can work at cross purposes. You see, communication happens not when you hear my words, but when you hear my meaning. And there is a significant difference there. So you can see how communication can be paradoxical. And another one, we think of ourselves as rational creatures, when in actual fact, we are more willful and emotional than rational. We only allow our rational mind, our understanding, to take control when we allow it. And there are times when our will, our emotions, do not allow our understanding to take control. I'll give you a couple of examples. When I was a young teacher, in my first couple of years, I'd heard a study that suggested that in order to have your criticisms heard by another person, you needed to praise twice as much. So offer 2 praises and 1 criticism was the proportion to do it. And that way the criticism would be heard. Now that's interesting, isn't it? In order to have a criticism heard, you must praise. And why is that? It's because we are willful, emotional creatures. We are not rational. We need to hear a person giving praise in order to accept the criticism, not as something against me, but something for my welfare and benefit. 13 years ago, when I stepped out of ministry for a while and went into piano teaching, my very first piano student, a young boy called Samuel. And Samuel was Asperger's, or what I called an Aspie. Very, very intelligent young man, very bright. But I learnt very early on with Samuel that if he perceived anything I said as a criticism of him, the rest of the half-hour piano lesson was completely lost. I couldn't do a thing with him. Didn't matter what I said. If he thought at any point I had criticised him, told him he'd done something wrong, that was it. So if that was 5 minutes into the lesson, the next 25 minutes are wasted. So how do you tell someone they're wrong? How do you correct someone without telling them they're wrong? You see, I couldn't tell Samuel, no, that's not the right way to do it, because he would just completely flip out. He would lose it. I'd not be able to teach him another thing. I had to invent creative ways of kind of gaming around it until he got to the point where he said, this is the right way to do it, Samuel, without saying, no, that's the wrong way. And it's because we are willful, emotional creatures, not rational ones. As I say, Samuel was highly intelligent. At one point in his lessons, he came to piano lesson one day, he said, look, I can play this scale in this hand and a different scale in that hand and do it at the same time. And then do 2 scales in opposite directions. And we had a half hour sitting there doing this, all funny. I'd just name a scale, 2 scales off the top of my head. Do this one with your left, do that one with your right, and off he'd go. Very intelligent young man. But if he thought I was telling him he was wrong, that was it. No more lesson. So what I want to do is I want us to go, as I say, in these next few weeks, next few months, is go on a paradoxical journey together. What I'm going to ask you to do this week, aside from Matthew chapter 11, is have a look at your own life. In what way is your life paradoxical? For example, your reactions to other people's words. Notice how that reaction can change from day to day. Notice your reaction to life circumstances and the way a particular mood that you might wake up with in the morning colours the way that you see the rest of the day. Because it can. I'll tell you one of my favourite stories, just to finish off, was when Pam and I were newly married, and I was teaching. I was in my end of my first year of teaching in a high school in Sydney. And on Fridays, on that day, my last 2 classes on Friday were my 2 worst classes. Okay? So Friday, end of the week, you're very, very tired and you get your 2 worst classes at the end of the day. I never had a good Friday, except once. The one day I had a good Friday was that at lunchtime, Pam had rung me up and said that she was expecting our first child. And that changed my attitude for the rest of the afternoon. And I had a good Friday that one day in that year. You see, your mood can affect the way you perceive the people and circumstances that you meet along your life. So just notice that as you go about your life this week. Look for the paradoxical and see if you can find it.